All right. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to those who are on the dial in here. This is going to be a very, very interesting conversation, stimulating, and I am deeply honored to have the privilege of having these two gentlemen on either side. I will introduce them in a minute. You have come to a conversation about putting the environment at the heart of economic decision making. How does economics and the environment in the context of climate change and biodiversity all work together? And for many, many years, I would say, and I'm Inger Andersen, the head of UNEP, I would say that climate has been sort of the bigger domination in the space of environmental conversations. But we need to also have a serious conversation around biodiversity, that very planet that sustains us. And the beauty of today, Nature Day, here in COP26, is that we are having that conversation in many, many places. It's taken us a long time to get nature mainstreamed in the biodiversity conversations. Now, as you know, here at COP26, this is beginning to happen. And the Biodiversity Convention will be having its COP in May next year. And we will also obviously there make that linkage to climate change as well as to pollution and land. So, in a way, it could be said, really, that the biodiversity crisis is a lot more alarming because nature regulates the very systems upon which life on Earth depends, the hydrological cycle, the fertility of our lands, the way we live, what we eat, how we sustain ourselves. And if we obviously push nature into a corner, it will send us invoices in the forms of droughts and floods and fires, etc. So we're going to have this very, very interesting conversation, I'm sure. And allow me then to introduce these distinguished gentlemen on either side of me. I will start with Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. He is a Frank Ramsey Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge and Chair of the Management Board at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge. He's a Fellow of both the Royal Society and the British Academy, and a Foreign Associate of the US National Academy of Sciences. He's won numerous economics awards and was recently awarded the Kew International Medal for work to protect nature and stop biodiversity loss, the first economist to receive this accolade. His research interests cover many aspects, including welfare and development economics, the economics of technological change, population, environmental and resource economics, and the economics of social capital. And in 2019, he was commissioned by the UK Treasury to lead the Global Independent Review on the Economics of Biodiversity, which everyone here, I'm sure, knows, was published in February of 2021. And to my right, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Lord Nicholas Stern. He is the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government and Chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics. He was previously Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and Chief Economist and Senior Vice President at the World Bank. He's also won numerous economic awards, and he's a Fellow of the Royal Society, and he's a past President of the British Academy. And during his tenure as Second Permanent Secretary to Her Majesty's Treasury, he was commissioned to deliver a review on the economics of climate change, which was published in 2006. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're in for a very, very interesting conversation, I'm sure, a conversation where we will explore economics of climate and biodiversity. And so maybe I'll kick it off, and then we'll get a free-flowing, and then we'll open it up to the broader audience here. But let me just be allowed to kick it off. And I'll ask the same question to both of you here, but you will take it in whichever way you want. And let me start with you, Partha. If you could help us understand how these issues, climate or maybe you wish to emphasize the degradation of nature, are connected and how they're different. I mean, how do we deal with biodiversity in an economic sense, and how we're dealing with climate. It's a small question, you can read. And how are they different? And how does economic help us understand these two?
Well, can people hear me?
Yes.
Well, my review is billed to be the economic review of the economics of biodiversity, but pretty quickly I realized that I wasn't going to write about biodiversity. What I did was to write about ecosystems, which are capital assets. So it's absolutely transparent as to why, when you look at it that way, as to why it's essential that nature enters into economic analysis. Economics is concerned with the allocation of goods and services, in particular, the way we use capital assets like buildings and machines and so forth, produced capital and human capital, health and education, people transforming inputs into final outputs. But the one class of assets which had been missing for pretty much the time I've been an economist is, of course, nature. And so my review was about ecosystems as capital assets, okay? And biodiversity is extremely important because there is a deep sense in which biodiversity enhances the productivity of ecosystems, which, as you pointed out, has so many services on offer, not just climate regulation, but so many others. So to me, climate is one of the services that nature provides. There are many others. And here's the key thing, and then I'll pass it on to Nick. The key thing to me was that what the ecologists these days call regulatory and maintenance services, which are the ones that Inger drew attention to, say pollination is one, degradation of waste, recycling of waste is another, and so forth, nitrogen fixation and climate regulation. These are complementary services. And that's extremely important to bear in mind, in the sense that if you press hard on one of them, in other words, degrade nature to the extent that one of the services is degraded, then others will follow suit. Now, it is true that nature is resilient. She's tough because she has survived 4.3 billion years. But on the other hand, we are so smart, or we like to think we are so smart, that if we put our mind to it, we can make nature extremely non-resilient, and that's why we are here.
There you go. Over to you.
Thank you, thank you, Inger. And let me begin by saying that Partha's review is an extremely important and valuable piece of work, and if you have not read it, then you should. And I'm sure those who have read it are represented here, but perhaps those who have not read it are also represented here. So go away and do some homework this weekend. I fully agree with what Partha has just said, so let me not repeat it, but just add one or two things to it. Climate change, unmanaged climate change, destroys biodiversity, and destruction of biodiversity accelerates climate change. There are lots of things that we do that are bad for both. You know, CO2 acidifies the oceans and is bad for the climate. But there are important differences as well. Climate is a subset of the whole story. We can damage we can damage ecosystems in much more ways than through climate change. I mean, overfishing, pesticides, I mean, full of examples of how we can do that. And finally, there's lots more, but finally, biodiversity, environment, ecosystems can be very local in their impact in a way that climate is a general thing. Although it manifests itself locally, it's the whole lot. It's the total amount of concentrations in the atmosphere, regardless of where the kg of CO2 or other greenhouse gases came from. So very important interweavings, but also very important differences. And one part of the bottom line is that biodiversity ecosystems is actually much more difficult than climate change, because this notion of a kg of CO2 as what you're trying to manage and bring down, which is absolutely central, is a simple story. I mean, it can get very complicated. Look at, there are 30,000 people here grappling with it, but the operations at work in biodiversity and ecosystems are inherently more complex.
I think that's quite right. But if I could corollary, you're absolutely right, Nick. But I don't want people to be depressed with the thought that complication is going to make life it's impossible to touch upon the problems that we're discussing here. The reason is that there is a sense also in which the economics of biodiversity is, in some sense, simpler. Because if you study ecosystems, that's the unit of account, if you like, in my review, you're looking for the productivity of ecosystems. So the idea is to try and tease out the productivity and then use those estimates for making economic decisions and policy. Now, of course, the kicker here is that productivity is not going to be reflected in the prices that we actually face. Very often they won't, although there'll be cases where you can. But where the economist can come in with the help of ecologists, not just and earth scientists, is to try and find ways of peering into the mechanisms, the processes that are guiding the ecosystems and therefore the output that we all enjoy. And so I think, in a way, I'm trying to argue that this subject is much more amenable to the economist's grammar than you might think. And Nick is exactly right in thinking that climate has this great virtue of being reducible to one or two parameters, and in particular that it's a global public good. Right. And rightly so, that many ecosystems are local. But of course that also makes it more natural to study, because we economists like to study communities, households, what they do with their environment. So it's a very rich subject, and I'm trying to sell the subject to young economists in the crowd here, because it is very exciting. It's a very beautiful subject also.
We're very glad that you're selling the subject to the crowd here on economics of climate change, as well as economics of biodiversity. I think when we look at the driver of both, we in the UN would say that the driver is unsustainable consumption and production. We would say, and that's SDG 12 put on its head, SDG 12 speaks to sustainable consumption and production. And when we look at IPBES, the IPCC twin for biodiversity, for those who are not the initiated, they speak about these 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. One being over-exploitation, so over-extraction, too much fishery, too much what have you, as well as the driver, obviously, of fragmentation and land conversion. And then there's a driver of climate change, pollution, etc. So these are the primary drivers here. So it would be interesting then, when we think about that, unsustainable consumption and production, how do we make gear shifts? What are the tools that we need to use to make some of these gear shifts? It'll be interesting to hear from both of you on that. I'll start with you.
Okay. Absolutely right. We have to break the destructive relationship between consumption and production and the way we live on one hand, and what we do to our environment and climate on the other. And we're not going to get to net zero by mid-century by having zero consumption at mid-century. We're going to have to make the consumption and production processes far less damaging, in the case of climate, zero damaging, and it would be great if we made it positive, including for biodiversity, if we started putting things back that we've been taking away. So how do you break that destructive relationship? Well, part of it, as Partha has already introduced, and a big theme in the biodiversity review, is to confront people with the costs of what they do. Now, you can confront people with the costs of what they do in a number of ways. One, of course, and economists tend to go that first, and for good reason, is a price. Yeah? But you can confront people with the costs of what they do also by transparency and information. And for example, the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, following on a really good example of the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, is something which shines the light and forces people to reveal the consequences of their actions. Now, that may be complicated, but the principle is extremely important. And to the second thing is transparency and information. A third thing is regulation and standards. People tend to say boo when you say regulation, and standards are sort of okay. I mean, who wants low standards, right? But so standards for what you can use. I mean, you can't use pesticides which have these kinds of properties. That's an important part of the story. You can't buy an internal combustion engine car in the UK after 2030. And then the next kind of thing that you can do is design so that these things are much less likely to happen. So, you know, cyclists and pedestrians going up the pecking order in cities and designing cities so that it's much easier to do that. So there are all sorts of ways in which you can break that relationship between the destruction that consumption, production, ways of living causes onto the environment. Fine to start with prices, but you really have to go beyond that.
Thank you. It would be interesting to hear from you.
Yes, I very much agree with Nick and all this. I would want to add a few additional points. One of them being to re-stress Nick's point that we need regulations. There is a presumption that prices can handle any scarcity problem, but it's really based on very naive view of economics thinking, actually. It's not just... you need regulations, you need quotas, you need, and in some sense, the 1.5 target, that sort of way of thinking, that's not a price-guided target. It's you first figure out where you want to be and then worry about how to get there, okay? So the prices take a sort of a second, it stays behind, so to speak. And that's right. It's right because Mother Nature is extremely non-linear. And so there are all sorts of tipping points hanging around out there. And of course, these are not only for the future. If you read the literature on deep poverty in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, villages, they go under. Literally, they have seen tipping points. That's why they have distressed migration in this world, because things have gone awry. The stocks of capital assets have been destroyed through overuse or whatever, okay? So that's one reason we really need to think in terms of quantity constraints. Of course, allied to prices goes without saying. But I want to add one further point, which is, where do these prices come from? Where do these quotas come from? So in some sense, you need to work backwards from the observation that the demands we are making on nature on an annual basis, let us say, for the goods and services that she offers us, currently vastly exceeds nature's capacity, ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. Of course, on an unsustainable basis, she's doing that already. We're basically degrading it, okay? Degrading her. But for sustainability, we need an equality between demand and supply, sustainable supply. Then you work backwards. And in some sense, the 1.5 is a metaphor for this kind of thinking, which you translate into all the other services as well, okay? That in the 1.5 is saying that's what we want as a target, how do we achieve it? Whereas in my review, what I was suggesting was that you really want to look at the demand and supply of these services. There will be a vector of services, not just one, but sometimes you might be able to aggregate. However, one final point, which is that then you ask yourself, what are the factors affecting this demand? And Nick was addressing some of them. One of them, of course, in the climate change case, is efficiency by which we transform Mother Nature services, goods and services, into final products, things that we want. In the case of climate change, of course, there's a ready-made thing, clean energy, quote unquote. Well, that means you can have the same amount of energy, but you don't demand that much out of Mother Nature. That's the idea. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that the idea that this is going to be a costless transition to sustainability, by which I mean demand equals supply on a sustainable basis, is wrong. I think it's not going to be costless. We have to, if you're going to charge prices, then of course the cost of living goes up, things become more expensive. How that will transform into innovations, and therefore the style of life our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren enjoy, hopefully, is something we should not even bother to predict, because it's a waste of time. things change. And they may well, in principle, have a much better life than we do, while demanding less from Mother Earth. We can't tell that in advance.
Oh, I like that optimism, looking that far ahead. I don't know. It would be interesting to hear from you as you respond to what you just heard, but I'd like also to, if you could reflect a little bit on, because we've pumped $15 trillion into the economy to recover from COVID. Is there something there that one can use? And have we done good so far? And can we accelerate on that regard?
I think you have to think of the big resources that have gone into COVID economic recovery as rescue. So what you're doing is essentially trying to restore, maintain the economy as it is. You know, you've got the immediate problems of unemployment and so on. We ought to discuss the health side as well, but just focusing on the economic side. Most of it's been rescue in that sense. It hasn't been change or reform. And I think that now, perhaps even before now, is the time to move strongly now from rescue to sustainable recovery and onto a new pattern of development. And we have to invest a lot to get to this picture that we're describing of organizing our activities, consumption, production, way of life in a way that doesn't destroy. We have to invest to get there. But those investments will have, if we do it right, tremendous returns. Already, of course, in power, renewable power sources, indeed round the clock renewable power sources, are already cheaper than the dirty alternatives, even without a carbon price, right across the world. That observation is going to move quickly to transport, and it's not so far away. If we could get green hydrogen down to something like a dollar a kg, which I think we can by 2030, then you're starting to see things like steel in the money as well. So all of this requires investment, it requires innovation, changing ways of doing things. But these are investments with very powerful returns. I much prefer to think of them as investments. Now, some things will become more expensive for a while. Some things will become more expensive probably indefinitely. But other things are already becoming cheaper. And on top of that, of course, we get cities where we can move and breathe and be productive, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. And economists tend to sort of drop back too fast into trade-offs. There are big choices that we have to make and big investments that we have to make, and we have to think hard and quickly, because we're in a hurry, how to get those right. But this is about designing and bringing a new and much more attractive form of investment, but working out how we get those investments done that we need to do, including the dislocation which will take place for some important groups of workers.
I mean, one point that often worries the United Nations is obviously that you have a significant degree of energy poverty. There are countries where you're still at 30–40% access to modern energy, and they may even sit on a pile of hydrocarbon under their feet. And so obviously that's a difficult thing. How do we get smart investment, whether it be in nature positive agriculture, i.e. that will not have the destructive dimensions, or in smart renewable? How do we leapfrog in those countries that must invest in expanding their network? I think that'll be interesting to take it to the developing countries, and that those realities, which are what decision makers face every day, because a population is asking for these services, food, energy, and a brighter future. What do you think, Partha?
It's a tough one. It's to summarize. But I think there is an advantage of keeping the energy problem slightly out of focus for a while, because when we think of investment, I think the picture at the back of your mind is people in hard hats drilling the earth to build a building or something, or paving the road. Investment in Mother Nature very often, in fact almost invariably, involves leaving her alone because she grows on her own, left alone. So investment here is waiting for her to recover. And that's very different from the notion of investment that we carry in our head, and particularly given the fact that it's extremely important for the world's poorest people to have a situation where their local ecosystems don't get degraded. Of course, if they get degraded, they want something else to substitute for it in order to make their days to be able to live through the day. That's for sure. But what they're doing is substituting, creating a demand for produced goods for the loss of the natural capital. And the natural capital I have in mind would be something like twigs, wood, water, medicinal plants, you name it. It is quite remarkable how much of Mother Nature's goods and services are consumed or used on a daily basis by the world's poorest relative to their budget. Something like 40% or so comes directly from the local ecosystem. So everything that's been said so far is in total agreement, but there is a danger of thinking that this is an area where it requires massive funds from the state or getting the private sector to engage in investment. Here, I want to sort of add to it the fact that in some ways investment really means leaving large chunks of nature alone. And that's that's investment too. And the rate of return is extremely high. For example, one of the earliest calculations in my review, I showed that the yield of primary producers globally, primary producers are plants, algae, and many bacteria which convert sunlight into photosynthesize. Okay, without them, we're done for. The yield of primary producers is of the order of 20% a year, and the yield for normal, the other average yield on produced capital is at best historically about 4 to 5%. So there's a huge gap there. Now, those of you who do finance will say, of course, there may be a gap in the two yields, but it may be made up by capital gains on the produced capital. The trouble is the capital gains will be the wrong direction because we've been mining nature, so she's going down. Meanwhile, we have been accumulating produced capital and human capital. They've gone up. So the relative price of the two will be actually going the reverse direction. The capital gains will be on nature. She will become more and more expensive in real terms over time. And so we have really been slaughtering nature, even though she's much more productive than investment in. I mean, that's a clear-cut case. There's no ifs and buts about it.
I'm very glad you mentioned this, and so I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't make a plug for the negotiations that are underway for the post-2020 biodiversity framework, in which one of the areas that are being negotiated is how much are we willing to set aside for nature to recover and do its stuff, right? And we agreed in 2010 that we were going to set aside 17% of terrestrial coverage and 10% of marine. We are within squeaking distance of making the 10% of marine. And we'll see. We didn't make it by the 2020 deadline, by the way, but COVID sort of gave us a little bit of a space of breather. But now we'll see there's a new framework. It's much more ambitious and looking at what is proposed in draft 30% on the marine side and an upping of the terrestrial side. So I can see that you would like to come in on this. So over to you.
You asked a question about energy,
yes,
which is
exactly.
very important.
Yeah.
And the kinds of investments that we have to make are physical capital, natural capital, and indeed human capital, and depending on how you express your capital, social capital as well. And there are many of us who are working in detail on what those kinds of investment involve. We've got to shut down the coal-fired power stations. The damage they're doing to our climate and our biodiversity are immense, and those energy demands are there. So we do have to invest strongly, largely in renewables, and we probably have to, as a world, multiply our electric power capacity by a factor of around 4 between now and mid-century, so we can stop doing all the dirty stuff and also respond to people's desire for development in all its. I mean, when I say development, I mean very roughly speaking what you might track on the Sustainable Development Goals. Not perfect, but just to give an idea of what we have in mind. So we really do have to invest a great deal in energy, but clean energy. And you asked also about impoverished parts of the world. You mentioned Africa. Decentralized solar is very powerful now. I don't know if is anybody from Selco in Bangalore here. There's somebody around from Selco, and a wonderful Harish Hande. They've combined microfinance and micro solar, and it started in Karnataka, but it's right across India now. Many more examples from Africa as well. And of course, you're protected. Those of you who've lived and worked in many countries, whether they're rich or poor, know that there's a lot of corruption in the power sector because they've got their hands on your switch. And the decentralized solar story is very, very helpful for that kind of empowerment as well. And following up what Partha said, if you think of the mangroves, you should think about mangroves a lot, actually. And they are mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and development. The amount of carbon stored in the mangroves is very high. They are wonderful for shrimps and fish. In some parts of the world, indeed, you've got tigers there, and people come and look at the tigers. It's good for tourism. And of course, they're tremendously important against storm surges. And you can design systems, it's very much along the lines Partha was describing, where, for example, those people who are fishing for shrimps are also participating in looking after the mangroves. And there are examples, of course, of exactly of this kind of thing. Those who are, if in the case of tourism and national parks and so on, those who are running the lodges and so on, that you can tax them to help pay for the maintenance of the wilding and so on that Partha was talking about. So there are ways of organizing so that these different kinds of investment can take place, but we have to be crystal clear that we're going to have to invest a great deal in clean energy over the next 30 years. And finally, should you be exploiting those other things just because they happen to be there? No. I sat in Africa Day in COP17 in Durban, 2011, on the platform with the extraordinary Prime Minister of Ethiopia then, Meles Zenawi. And these are Meles's words. He said, "It is not justice to foul the planet because others have fouled it in the past." And he was speaking then, in all these discussions for the African Union.
Exactly. I think that's important to recognize. Let's step a little bit into where some of the pressure points on biodiversity exist, and then I'm now picking up from the Slido questions that have come in from across the world, I expect, really. And there's a question here that is directed to both of you, but it really wants to speak to the issue of, look, there are these enormous drivers and interests on deforestation in some of the great basins, the tropical forests of Africa, the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin. How to approach that, and how can economics give us a helping hand?
Well, I'm glad somebody has asked me this question because it's something I've been banging on about for several months. But okay. So you've got if you want to take the prototypical rainforests, tropical rainforests, which are a biome of the most extraordinary significance, they're global public good. I don't have to explain why they are a global public good. They serve the entire globe, and yet they're within national jurisdiction, okay? So that should tell us something. It tells us that the incentive, never mind wickedness. I mean, let's assume that the national leaders really care about their own people, all right? Even so, the incentive for them to maintain it is lower than the incentive the global community has because it's a global public good, and they're the small part of the world population. So keep that in mind on the one. On the other hand, we have another global public good, a biome called the oceans. Something like 68% of the Earth's surface. I'm talking about beyond the 200-mile EEZ, okay? And that's under threat. Now, why is it under threat? It's because it's open access. You can use it, nobody has to pay for it. You can fish there, trawlers. We've seen signs of that. And of course, all of the trillions of dollars of merchandise which are shipped daily across the, annually across the oceans. Nobody pays any price because the oceans belong to nobody because we think it belongs to everybody. So that's a problem. Now, pull the two together, and what does economics tell us? Since you asked me what the economic answer is, that we should have an international institution like run by the United Nations, if nothing else. Our forefathers had the courage to institute these global public goods suppliers like the World Bank, IMF, and the United Nations herself within 4 or 5 years of the end of the Second World War. Why did they do that? Because that was bold and imaginative, and I'm suggesting that we should have something like that for the global public goods. Charging for the use and banning, of course, not just charging. We've gone through this as to why there may be restrictions also that have protected zones and so forth. But in addition, charging for the use of it, which would raise billions each year. And that could be used to compensate nations for payment for ecosystem services. That's a commonly used phrase, but now use it at the international level, saying we'll pay Brazil, we'll pay. Of course, that will require negotiation. There'll be a huge amount of hue and cry, goes without saying, but that's part of life. You negotiate. I mean, I used to have to negotiate with my children. So, I mean, everybody has. So that's okay. But I think we should not fear that. There is a ready-made way, institutional readjustment that can be made to give the people their incentive to do that. And of course, today, monitoring these global public goods is much easier than it was 50 years ago. You have hugely good satellite images, so you can see who is tarnishing a piece of, it's at a very local level. So that's one answer to your question. But I do want to come back to, I hope you'll be asking me, about the fact that the greatest biodiversity, and therefore in some sense the productivity of the maintenance and regulatory services that I was talking about previously, happen to be in the tropics. And of course, tropics also house some of the world's poorest people. And it's not an accident that has happened, but the fact is at the moment that's how we should take. And that raises certain questions which I hope you'll raise.
We will do so. Okay. We have 7 minutes or so. Please.
Yeah,
that would be very helpful.
We're in a desperate hurry.
Yeah.
And we don't know how close the Amazon is to the tipping point where it becomes a completely different ecosystem. We've already cut down ballpark 15%, maybe more. Perhaps it would flip at 20-25%. I mean, we're very close on that. We're in a big hurry. So we have to, right now, get the existing institutions. And they really do have some firepower, working very closely on these issues of the global public goods. And we have to get them to step up what they're doing and to stay up, because this doesn't go away after 5 minutes. They've got to keep going, and that means the shareholders have got to get behind them as they change the way we do things. So there's tremendous potential for our existing international financial institutions, development banks, development institutions, to do much more, and they have to do it very quickly. And that should be something which the shareholders, developing countries and developed countries, demand of them.
Absolutely. And I think just to add here a little sort of gripe, some of us who've been in this journey for a long time remember in 1992 there was an effort to make a convention on forests. It failed miserable. We will remember that in 2014, leaders pledged exactly what they pledged earlier this week, i.e., to stop all deforestation and reverse it by 2030. So it is about stepping on the accelerator, electric of course, so that we can get to where we need to go to. I would like to get to the point around poverty and understanding how we are going to address that issue in a very constrained setting with poverty being dominated. How will we address both biodiversity and climate change. I've sort of been asking around this issue, but and what are some of the drivers that get us to where we are? I'm mindful that we have limited time, and so I put that question out there, but I put a second question as well, which is, and I will divide the time between the two of you. Professor Stern, you have referred to climate and biodiversity as geography and complexity. And the question therefore is, does that mean that biodiversity loss needs to differ by location too? So one place it's okay to have the loss, and other places we will accept none. So I will come back to you on the sort of geography and complexity, but I'd like to turn to you on the poverty dimension first.
Thank you very much. This is the deepest part of poverty. Current poverty is in the sub-Saharan Africa. That's the data are clear. And I have many friends there, I have students. And one of the things that we are talking here, of course, the economics of biodiversity is really concerned with the economics of externalities, writ large, from the small to the large, okay, from the household up to the international level, okay? So it's really a codification of these externalities and seeing how they shape up. Okay, now, one of the factors that makes for this gigantic demand that the world is making is population, which not just the standard of living and the efficiency parameter that we've already discussed, what we demand for it, but population. Now, the poorest countries of the world in Africa are, in terms of resource use, global resource use, are negligible because they are economically very small. If you take GDP as an index of the demand that a nation makes on Mother Nature, then she's negligible. The problem is about the future, their future, my friends' future, the children, my friends' children's and children's future. And there, the thing that is really bothering is a huge population growth there. Fertility rates in Africa are over 4 still. Sub-Saharan Africa. In Nigeria, for example, it's 5.4. And from a population of 200 million, the country will become 400 million by the middle of this century. So that puts an enormous pressure on the state and the nation itself, on the ecosystems that are there, because they will be wanting to raise income by exporting. In fact, I can bet international institutions will be saying, in order to raise your level, you better step up exports. Well, there'll be primary products going out, and again, pressure on that. So in that kind of a world, it seems to me there is a great synergy to be had when we talk about women's empowerment, that they have access to the means of being able to have some command over their own bodies. And at the moment, millions, 200 million plus women in the reproductive phase have no access to family planning and modern reproductive health services. And I think that's a shame. They should be given that because this is a coincidence of demand.
Right.
They need it, and yet we're not actually supplying the wherewithal for that to happen. So this is a women's empowerment issue as well. And it coincides in many ways with Mother Nature's services, because in many ways, in the poorest households, it's the women who handle the local ecosystems. They gather the water.
I'm going to say that this is really important, agency over our bodies and rights, equal rights before the law. We have 1.5 minutes left, so I'm going to give you the final word. And rather than forcing any question on you, Nick, I'll ask you to make a sort of closing remark here.
Let me fully agree with what Partha and you, Inger, just said about access to education for girls and women and reproductive health care. So it's a very important part of the whole story of human rights, climate, biodiversity, and justice. You asked about poverty. Yeah. Decentralized solar is a big part of poverty. And women don't have to go to get firewood. You have different ways of cooking in the home, which helps with indoor air pollution. A really empowering story. That's a big example. Public transport is very important in poverty reduction. Restoring degraded land is very good for poverty reduction, capturing carbon in the soil and so on. So I just wanted to have a few very quick comments on poverty. Finally, to close off, this is an investment story right across the world. It's an investment story which demands good policies to pull that investment through, remembering that that investment is not just physical capital, it's also natural capital. We can now see what investments we have to make, and it's the duty of the rich countries, as a matter of climate justice, biodiversity justice, fighting poverty, delivering on the sustainable development goals, to work out how they can best support that kind of investment which will be shaped in the developing world. And that, I think, is something we should look for in this COP, and that some of us are working on.
Well, look, you have heard it from these two distinguished professors and amazing economists who have committed their lives to finding ways that economics can work and help us make for a more sustainable planet. Understanding biodiversity and the economics of biodiversity, you have unlocked that for the world. And we're really grateful to you, and you've done it in the year when we were, well, now the COP got delayed, but actually the fact that it came out so early has enabled a global conversation and a deeper understanding of nature as an asset class. We are deeply in your debt. And back in 2006, you helped us understand the economics of climate change. And ever since then and before, you've been on the warpath for climate. We will look forward to Professor Dasgupta being on the warpath for nature, as you have been for decades and decades already. So with that, can you give a round of applause to these two amazing professors? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And now, I'm very pleased to hand it over to the Honourable Philip Dunn, who is MP, and he will close Nature Day, as I understand it. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Inger. Well, I've been asked to, as you say, to close the session today on behalf of the UK presidency. I think it is undoubtedly the case that we have left the best till last. To have a session with such distinguished guests as we've just had, so we're ably chaired by Inger, I think raising issues that are at the forefront of not just this day, but of what this whole conference is about and what the next COP15 conference next year in Kunming will be all about. Nick, you started this by your review in 2006, as Inger has just told us, by introducing the economics of climate change into a manner that that countries around the world have learnt from and have developed. And we've taken that forward through the UK commissioning Sir Partha Dasgupta with his review of nature to create a framework in which we can try to understand in economic terms how natural capital is so critical and can be preserved if we value it properly. And that really is utterly essential if we're going to get the global north to engage with the global south and to allow the planet to be valued for what it gives to us as humankind. I particularly, through the Environmental Audit Committee that I chair in Parliament, have valued the work that you've done earlier this year. We've produced 2 reports, as you may have seen, since you kindly gave evidence to us. We intend to do far more on this subject. And it provides us, I think, as you've just said earlier today, with a sense of hope and optimism that there are ways in which we can restore nature to provide value to allow humankind to survive. I think your advice that we should do most by valuing leaving nature alone is a really a nice way of trying to encapsulate what we need to do. We need to find mechanisms to reward people for leaving nature alone, and those mechanisms, we can learn from how we've rewarded companies for carbon sequestering and the work that came from Nick Stern. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking you both, Nick Stern and Partha Dasgupta, for a really fascinating discussion this evening. And I wish we could have continued for another 2 hours, but I know we're going to have to conclude. And thank you, Inger, very much indeed for hosting the session. So the session is over. Thank you very much indeed.